Good evening and welcome to the Carnegie Council. I'm Joel Rosenthal, President of the Council, and I'm delighted we're serving as your hosts for this evening. My goal and my wish is for you to feel at home here at the Carnegie Council, not just for this evening, but also into the future. When I was 14 years old, I was lucky enough to take a class in ethics. And what I remember most about that class is the teacher saying, look at your friends, and that's who you are. Look at your friends, and that's who you are. And the fact that the Carnegie Council and the Hastings Center are such good friends makes me think we're on the right track. We share the same mission to address the most critical ethical challenges of our time and to produce rigorous and relevant thought leadership to improve our communities. We not only produce thought leadership like you will see this evening, but we also build communities of engagement and practice while providing educational resources that have both immediate and lasting value. Now, I never met Andrew Carnegie, who founded this institution in 1914, but I was lucky enough to meet the founders of the Hastings Center, Willard Galen and Daniel Callahan. And I know that the reason we're here today is that their inspiration is timeless. Their vision for the role that ethics can and should play in our personal, professional, and public lives is truly eternal. And it is our privilege to stand on their shoulders. Tonight's Callahan lecture is just the latest example reflecting the efforts of all of you assembled here in person and also online for the live webcast. The Callahan spirit also continues in the inspired leadership of the Hastings Center, led today by Dr. Vardit Ravitsky and Dr. Joseph Fins. Now, I can't say enough. I got the floor so I can say something good. I really want to say this about Vardit and Joe. I'm just so honored to be here introducing them. For me, they're true role models. They set the bar, they set the pace, and they set the high aspirations that we share for making the world a more just, humane, and better place. Vardit, Joe, and the great fellows and staff of Hastings show us that this vision is not just a dream, but a reality made possible through a lot of hard work and commitment. Vardit and Joe are also warm, friendly, and fun, thus proving that ethics is lively, not dull, full of life, not a dismal science. So with that, I want to just thank you all for coming and for allowing us to host this evening and to spend this precious evening together with all of you. And it's now my genuine honor to pass the floor to Joe Fins to get the program started.
Thank you so much, Joel. That was really kind, and I feel like I should start with a joke. But I really want to thank you and the Carnegie Council for the vital work that you do in this beautiful space, and for the ethical rigor you bring to global issues that are so pressing in our time today. And partnerships like this one are really central to our work, and we look forward to working with you in perpetuity. Welcome to all of you here in the room and all of those folks online for joining us tonight for the live stream. We're so glad you're with us, and we're grateful for the support from the Jeanette Lappe Memorial Fund for helping to make tonight's program possible. The Daniel Callahan Annual Program commemorates Hastings Center's co-founder, Dan Callahan, and his commitment to public engagement on thorny issues of public policy. Dan, a philosopher, and Will Galen, a psychoanalyst, co-founded the center in 1969 with a then radical idea and conviction that the ethical challenges posed by healthcare, science, and technology require not only rigorous scholarship, but also broad public engagement and discussion like we're having tonight. That they demand conversation across differences among thoughtful people willing to both challenge and listen to each other. For more than 50 years, the center has been informed by this process, the Hastings Center way. And as we look to the next 5 years, guided by a strategic plan that reaffirms our commitment to rigorous research, trusted publications, and meaningful engagement, our founders' inspiration is more relevant than ever. Today's world makes collaborative, inclusive, and intellectually serious exchange both harder and more necessary. As someone who has been involved with the Hastings Center for my entire career and having Dan and Will as mentors, I can tell you that evenings like this one, bringing people together, serious minds together across institutions in genuine dialogue to debate the ethics of editing human embryos are what the center was built for. We're glad you're here, not only to listen, but also, I hope, to participate. It's now my great personal pleasure and honor to introduce our president and CEO, Dr. Vardit Ravitsky. Vardit.
Thank you again to the Carnegie Council for hosting us. Thank you, Joe. Welcome to our special guests in the room. Quick reminder to turn off your cell phones. Thank you. Warm welcome to the hundreds of people joining us online from around the world. And another special warm welcome to the many journalists who are with us tonight. I'm sure you'll write fascinating stories about our conversation. No pressure, Glenn and Cathy. Our topic tonight is gene editing. Scientific innovation now allows us to edit DNA quite precisely. This is currently done on animals and in rare cases on patients. But our focus tonight is very specific. We're going to talk about genetically editing the human embryo in vitro following IVF. And I'm not going to get into scientific detail, but it's important to highlight that if you edit a human embryo in an early stage of development, technically that edit would appear in all the cells of the body of the baby that would be born of that embryo, including the sperm or egg, which means that that edit would pass on to the children, grandchildren, and all the subsequent potential generations born of that baby, which means that you made one edit, but on an evolutionary scale, you possibly had significant impact. And that means that our conversation tonight is, I don't want to be overly dramatic, but about the future of the human race. And this kind of topic really aligns beautifully with the strategic priorities of the Hastings Center. We want to be anticipatory. We want to look ahead, behind the corner, as Joe always reminds me. And we welcome the opportunity to discuss the ethical and social implications of a technology that is not yet available in the clinic. And before we launch the debate, I also want to step back and say something about the broader context of bioethics as a field. I find myself in many rooms as the bioethicist where the perception is that bioethics, or ethics in general, is always about the why not. It's about the issues, the concerns, the fears, the risks. And I think that bioethics should not preach to the choir, stay in its own echo chamber. It should engage with innovation because there's also a risk in opportunity cost. If we delay innovation, we create delays in the access of patients to important interventions. We must have convincing ethical reasons to delay. And so our conversation tonight is not about why not. It's not necessarily about why yes. It's forward-looking. It's asking whether there's a way forward that could use this technology for reproduction, which is outside the comfort zone of quite a few bioethicists, in a responsible and wise way, keeping in mind that we always need ethically justifiable goals for such use of technology, and that any emerging technology should do good in the world and not just benefit the select few. That is my framing of the discussion tonight. This is the kind of bioethics that we do at the Hastings Center. And this is a public event. We will take questions from those online as well. If you have a question, please type it into the chat function directly to the host of the event. We'll take questions from the room. And at this point, I will introduce our debaters. This is not a strictly technical debate. I will not be counting seconds and counting rebuttals. It's a facilitated conversation that is meant to identify areas of agreement and disagreement. But do keep to your time, Glenn and Cathy. Glenn Cohen is a professor of law and deputy dean at Harvard Law School. He's faculty director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. He is one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of bioethics and law. He's also the person with the best taste in glasses of all the academics I've ever met. No offense to my colleagues here. Not to mention his taste in shoes that I don't know if the people online can see. Cathy Tie is founder and CEO of Origin Genomics, which develops germline gene correction for preventable diseases under IRB-approved protocols in the United States. A Thiel Fellow, serial biotech founder, and board member of Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. She works at the intersection of frontier science and clinical translation. So my first question to you is not really a question. It's, would you give us some context? Why are you passionate about this technology? Why have you decided to study it, work on it? Glenn.
Okay, great. So to me, this is an incredibly exciting, if you talked about things in my lifetime that I thought would be science fiction rather than science fact, this is on that list. So incredibly exciting. Also incredibly scary in terms of the risks of off-target alterations, for example, the risks to future generations. But also when I think about inherent questions that are interesting to bioethics. What makes us the people that we are? What is the continuity of ourselves before and after an alteration? This forefronts issues of intergenerational justice. What do we owe our children? But also what the appropriate attitude is towards our children as people rather than products. It's complex in that it imposes both possible benefits and risks, and we're talking about future generations who have not consented to either of those things. It touches on very sensitive questions like the values of communities, questions of eugenics, questions about the expressive attitudes we express towards a trait or towards a way of being by the decision about what to edit. And like much of bioethics, this is something born in scandal, in that much of the discourse we have now is in relation to Dr. Zhenkui Hu's experiment in China, what I view as a completely unethical experimental activity that was undertaken, and the world had to react suddenly to that. And as a result, my view is that much of our policymaking in this space is relatively coarse, relatively on-off, and my hope is to kind of provoke a more nuanced discussion of what that might look like.
Thank you. Cathy.
I want to start by acknowledging what this moment is. We're gathered here for the annual Daniel Callahan Program, named after the philosopher who, in 1969, looked at the intersection of technology and human life and said that this needs its own field of study. And he was right. Tonight, 57 years later, we're living the question he helped create. I'm a founder. I build genomics tools. I am not a philosopher, and I'm not a bioethicist by training, and I suspect that's actually why I'm sitting here tonight. This debate has always needed the people actually holding the tools to be in the room, not just the people theorizing about them. And while I'm honored, I'm also aware of the weight of this moment, because what we're deciding, not just tonight, but in the years of policy, research, and regulation that follows the conversations like this one, is whether our species will use the most precise biological tool ever developed to prevent suffering, or whether we will let fear, dressed up as caution, make that decision for us. When I announced I'd be working on gene editing to prevent disease last year, my inbox is filled up in 2 languages. A woman in Ohio whose mother no longer recognizes her. A father in Shenzhen watching his son lose motor function to a mutation with a known address. A young woman with a BRCA1 mutation who has already buried 2 aunts with the exact same mutation. None of them used the language we'll use tonight. They didn't say, heritable edit. They said, please. 1 year in, and the thing that is already obvious to me is this. There's a massive dissonance between the academic nature of rooms like this one, where this is debated, and the urgency in the homes where this is lived. Somewhere along the way, science has become so granular that while we became really good at studying the patterns in the leaves, we forgot about the tree and the forest. We talk often about the danger of moving too fast. I want to name the danger of moving too slow, and the fantasy of waiting for global consensus, which will not arrive. This is what happens when the people setting the pace of progress are not the ones paying the price of delay. In 2015, the scientific establishment gathered in Washington and said, not yet. In 2018, they gathered in Hong Kong and said, not yet. In 2023, they gathered in London and said the exact same thing they said in 2015. 8 years, 3 international summits, 0 clinical approvals. But hey, at least we got 60-something reports and hundreds of papers. At the end of the day, the Child with Taste Act still dies before age 5, and federal funding for this research is still banned to make any progress whatsoever on the safety of this tool, even for the most dire diseases. This is why my one condition for participating in this debate tonight is to have genetic disease carriers in this room with us. So the people this debate is about are in the conversation, not just talked about. It is not done often enough, and it's way past due.
Follow up to you, Cathy. Your efforts received a lot of attention in the media. What has been the overall reaction? Positive, critical?
My goal with launching my work publicly was simple. It was to be transparent with the press and the public about the work needed to advance this field forward. I essentially said that the most consequential science of this century can be done and should be done, but only with transparency, oversight, and rigor. That is the ethical thing to do, not another 10-year moratorium. The field actually already knows this, and they just rarely admit it, at least for now. 5 years ago, saying anything like this out loud would have gotten you the same backlash that the industry has seen for a decade before that. Then something called mitochondrial replacement therapy, the first form of germline gene therapy that helped correct mitochondria mutations at the egg level, it was called the 3-parent child by the media. That wasn't a scientific critique, it was a slogan, and it costed us. Years later, the UK approved MRT, Australia followed, and now in 2026, over 100 children have been successfully born using MRT around the world. Yet the US still bans it. Why? Partially because the slogan outlived the science. There is real suffering when slogans like this go unchallenged. So I set out to challenge this. And the framing actually really resonated. When I went public with this, the reaction was that IVF physicians, scientists, patients, and even some ethicists have said some version of the same thing to me. It was something like, finally, someone is doing it. The honest truth is that people are tired of waiting for progress. It's a paradox. Back in 2015, people said that this technology was not safe enough, so therefore we should ban it. Funny thing is, in 2026, we're having the exact same conversation. Nothing really changed. The paradox is that if we don't work on it, it'll never be safe enough. So breaking that paradox means working on the science transparently and openly, which is exactly what I set out to do with my company, Origin Genomics.
And I will confess that Glenn and I collaborated on a paper to support the implementation of MRT in the US several years ago. So a point of agreement. To set the starting point for the debate, thank you for giving us context, very eye-opening. To set the starting point for the debate, I want to subject you to rapid fire. I'm going to ask you yes/no questions. In order to sort of focus in narrowly on when...
I feel like I'm on the witness stand. Go ahead.
Not where you used to be.
Exactly.
Are you ready? Do you think that editing human embryos is inherently unethical, that it can never be permissible?
No.
No.
We have agreement. So there is a point where it might be ethically permissible. Let's go more granular. Is it ethical to conduct research on human embryos in the lab to learn more, to improve the safety of this technology?
Yes.
Yes.
Yet again, agreement. Let's dive deeper. Can it ever be ethical to move to a clinical trial and implant an edited embryo to actually have an edited baby?
Yep.
And I also agree.
Well, this is not looking like a debate at all. So let's get into the things you may disagree on. My first real question is this. When do you think it would be ethically acceptable to implant an edited embryo? What case might justify the reproductive use of this technology? And if you will give us an example, what would be the first gene that you would target? For what disease, condition, or trait? Cathy, you go first this time.
I believe that the first use cases should be severe monogenic disorders with well-defined pathogenic variants. These are diseases and genes that current new advances in gene editing can tackle, such as with base editors, prime editors. And eventually, we'll later on move to other diseases, of course, like polygenic diseases or more complex heritable conditions. There are over 7,000 heritable monogenic diseases. Only 5% of them have FDA-approved cures. If I were to name all of these diseases, we'd be here all night, so I'll skip that. But some of them you might recognize: cystic fibrosis, Huntington's, sickle cell disease. And I think from a technological level, and this is something I've been working on very hard at my company, is how do you create a framework from a technology level to validate the safety of this tool at every stage of development? You know, I think first you start with patient iPSCs. You look at the specific mutation that the patients have. You test the newest gene editors against those mutations. You validate by sequencing before and after the gene edit to understand any bystander or off-target effects, any unintended consequences. Then, only then do you move into other IRB-approved research related to patient gametes. And same thing there, you want to do sequencing before and after to understand things like mosaicism, off-target effects, bystander effect, and then later on at the blastocyst stage, which is when the embryo gets to day 5, is when you do something called PGT, which is when you sequence that. Do a biopsy of the blastocyst, you sequence it before and after, and you understand how that gene correction has affected the embryo. So those are the areas of technology research that's applicable to understanding the safety of this tool. But just to reiterate, you would really start with the severe monogenic diseases, which is what we're doing at Origin Genomics.
Thank you. Glenn?
You know, we have more agreement than you might expect, although I do want to be careful here about the way we characterize the bioethical discourse here, and that it's not that everybody is saying moratorium, and that many bioethicists support this idea of serious monogenic risks as a possible use case here. But I want to make sure we're talking about the same things, right? So what do we mean when we talk about a serious disease? I'm thinking very much the way the NASEM and the Royal Society, in one of the many reports that maybe have been put into disreputable light here, but many of the reports recommended would be appropriate for a translational path. And what do I mean? It's a serious monogenic disease that causes severe morbidity or premature death. We should be limiting the edits to changing a pathogenic variant known to be responsible for the serious monogenic disease to a sequence that is common in the relevant population, that is known not to be disease-causing. And I'm not sure this is a place where we agree. It should be an instance where the family in question has no option for having a genetically related child that does not have the monogenic disease. That is to say, we want cases where I think they have no possible other way, other technologies for avoiding this outcome. And I actually agree that Huntington's is a good candidate for this, and as did the NASEM and the Royal Society in this. But it's important just to emphasize why it's a good candidate. Because remember, we are imposing risk. When we go first in human, it is inherently a risky move, and it is a transmission of risk to someone who never has the opportunity to consent, and indeed to many generations who don't have the opportunity to consent. And why it's justified is that the alternative for this particular family for having a genetically related child is something like early morbidity, really severe diseases. So to me, that is the right place to focus our attention.
Thank you. So I want to get even more granular. We recently read in the news about the first gene therapy that was developed specifically to save the life of a baby. Baby KJ was born with a rare genetic disorder and was successfully treated with a customized gene editing therapy by a team at CHOP in Philly. It was a race against the clock to save his life. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but it showed that such treatment can be possible. So my question to you is this. If a condition can be treated by gene editing after birth, do you think it is ethically justified to try the intervention in the early embryo despite these risks that you just mentioned, Glenn? And as a reminder, if you treat the baby, the edit only affects that baby. If you treat the embryo, the edit will pass on to all the potential future generations born of that baby. So the risks are on a different scale. We'll start with Glenn. Somatic is possible. Would you go germline?
So I will say presumptively, and I'll explain what I mean by this, presumptively this is not an appropriate case for heritable genome editing. And why do I say that? Here's why. We're talking about making people research participants without consent. These are future generations, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, who will be affected by the decisions we make. Scientists, clinicians, prospective parents are making a decision that are going to affect these future generations. And when we have the opportunity to instead ask the people who are going to be most directly affected and giving them the opportunity to make the choice, a choice that's going to affect them and affect their children, we should take that opportunity, which is the somatic edit, when it's possible. Now, to be fair, all acts of reproduction impose risks on the people who are reproduced, and they never consent. Shauna Schifrin has a famous article suggesting that maybe this makes reproduction a morally dicey process, right? But we're talking about reproduction in a kind of a limited way where we kind of know the range of outcomes. This is very different. This is an experimental procedure. And there are differences between reproductive activities by which an individual could not otherwise exist and those that alter the individual to become a different individual. As Jan Narveson said, the reasons to make children happy are very different than the reasons to make happy children. They're two different categories of reasons and ideas that we have to think about. And once again, this is not normal reproduction, but at least at first, an experimental form of reproduction that we should be taking seriously in this respect. So in my view, this makes it fundamentally different than regular reproduction. And we should not be making choices for others, let alone for generations forward, where there is instead a possibility of letting them choose themselves. I think we should be making decisions for ourselves, not decisions for our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. Now, I did say presumptive or pro tanto for the following reason. Maybe this view of mine might be overcome if you showed me that the heritable edit was much safer, for example, than the somatic. I could imagine a case, especially if we're talking about things within the serious bucket, where it might make a difference and I might have another look. But overall, I would start with the view that where somatic is available, germline is inappropriate.
Thank you. Cathy.
Seems like this idea of heritability keeps coming up, that this idea that you can do a gene edit at the germline level and it keeps being passed down to generation after generation. So I will take this framing head on because this is where ethical intuition breaks down when you examine it really closely. When parents consent to a gene therapy for a newborn, as they did with baby KJ's case, they're not making a decision that can be reversed. They're making it on behalf of a person who cannot yet consent. And they're making it knowing it will shape that person's entire future existence, in many cases, the health and the lives of the person's future children as well. The somatic therapy that saved baby KJ's life will shape every downstream decision he will ever make, whether to have children, how, with whom. Parental consent has always casted a shadow across generations. That is not a novel feature of germline editing. That is the basic structure of parental consent. So when we're told that the germline gene editing technology is ethically distinct because it propagates to future generations, the honest answer is this. Every parental decision propagates. Every consent they give shapes the next generation. The only difference with germline editing is that the propagation is molecular and measurable rather than social and diffuse. The ethical principle, proxy consent on behalf of a person who cannot yet consent in service of their best interest, is actually identical. And when I first heard this question of if the condition can be treated post-birth with somatic gene therapies like the one that baby KJ received, then is it still ethically justified to try the intervention in the early embryo? I thought of like a really simple example, which is Tylenol. You know, there's Tylenol, and there's also Advil, and there's also R&D for other pain relievers, pain-relieving drugs. Should they all cease to exist because we have Tylenol already? No, you can have both. I think both somatic and germline gene editing are complementary. It provides more options for family that suffer from these diseases. And not to mention, somatic gene therapies cost months to create and also months of treatment. Take, for example, the first FDA-approved somatic gene therapy, Castrobee. One, it costs $2 million. Two, it takes 3 to 6 months of treatment. And 3, it's extremely invasive. You have to go through chemotherapy versus an injection that happens at the embryo stage, which is going to be way less than $2 million USD per patient per dose. So I think that both can exist. I think germline gene correction represents an immense opportunity for patients to have more affordable gene therapies and also to correct a mutation when it is the most effective to do so at the earliest stages of human life. And whether or not this is going to be available tomorrow, that's going to be a no. But I think it can be available if we do all the right research to show that it's safe and efficient. And that's the work that the field, I believe, should be working on right now.
This calls for a rebuttal.
Yeah, great. So a point of disagreement, finally, which is good because we are in a debate here, right? So I think there's 2 places where we disagree. The first is just to understand what a parent-child relationship is like and why it is we give parents sometimes the prerogative to choose for their children. And that is that they have a special kind of relationship, including a commitment to bear the burdens of the choices they make in their child rearing. If your child turns out to be an a-hole, if you'll pardon my French, right, you have to rear that child for a long period of time. That is a facetious example, but it is exactly the same thing here we're talking about. You're making a decision about your child's health, and you, as the parent, are going to live with that decision for your life in a way you will not live with the decision of your great-great-great-great-great-great-great ad infinity grandchild. That's the first difference. The second difference is that when parents make these choices without being able to ask their children's consent, it is the best of the worst options when we're talking about something that's going to have a high morbidity, high mortality for the child in question. We have to act now. It's an emergency. It is not the desirable decisional space to be. And indeed, if there is an instance where you could wait and allow your child to reach a level of maturity, we would say it's better to engage that child in such a significant decision for that child. So to me, when a somatic edit is as safe and available, why wouldn't we ask children whether they want the edit or not? Why wouldn't we engage them in this decision? Now again, it's a presumption. There may be instances where it is not available, where there is a real risk of waiting. But when it is available, it seems to me we should ask each of us to make our own decisions about our own lives, our own destinies, and our own genetics.
To be fair, counter rebuttal.
Well, I think that baby KJ, who's the newborn infant that we're talking about here, I don't think the infant consented, right? I think it would be silly to think that. So that's why the ethical framework expands to embryos. Not only that, I think families should have the choice. It's about the choice of having the option to correct the genome of their children. And if that's something they want to get rid of in their family, they should have the option to do so. No one's coercing them. But taking that option away when the technology could be ready for them, I think that is a form of coercion on its own, and it's pretty unethical. So to say that, the great-great-great-grandchild will have a mutation that they didn't consent to, or a mutation corrected that they didn't consent to, the opposite is also true. The benefits can also compound, and they'll be thankful that their great-great-great-great-grandparent did that, so generations later they didn't have to suffer in that disease.
Wow, thank you. Moving on to the next question. We saw some disagreement regarding what would justify the use of gene editing in reproduction. But just like the two of you disagree, there is also wide disagreement amongst ethicists, scientists, and the public. What should we do in order to reach an appropriate level of social acceptability before starting clinical use? Do we need to reach global consensus, broad agreement at the national level, at the community level? And how should this be done? Who gets to decide? Should governments regulate what kind of edits should be permitted, and how might that be carried out? And this time, Cathy goes first.
First, the proposed consensus on a bioethical question is something we should stop pretending is realistic. We did not have consensus on IVF in 1978. The Pope opposed it, feminist scholars opposed it, disability advocates also objected. Today, roughly 10 million people are alive because of it. We didn't have consensus on the first heart transplant in 1967. Critics called it playing God. Some called it grotesque. It forced society to redefine what death itself meant. Today, open heart surgery saves roughly 2 million lives every year. We also didn't have consensus on Jenner's smallpox vaccine in 1796. There have been organized anti-vaccine movements continuously ever since, but today, smallpox has been eradicated from the face of the earth. If we had waited for consensus in any of these cases, we would not have had these technologies today. The right standard isn't consensus, it's legitimacy. And legitimacy is built from data, transparency, informed participation, and accountability. Which brings me to the missing piece of germline gene correction as it stands today. The reason why I cannot answer safety concerns with data is that we have been prevented from generating this data. The federal restrictions that make this research unfundable in the United States have been in place for over a decade. The appropriations rider that prevent the FDA from even reviewing germline applications have been renewed every single year since 2015. The Dickey-Wicker amendment blocks NIH from funding embryo research that would generate the safety data. In practice, only a handful of US laboratories have been able to do this work at all, and I've actually spoken to multiple of them. personally. So there is a structural problem that we should name plainly. We're told that the science is not ready, that the same system has prevented the science from being ready. You cannot put a technology in a regulatory cage for 15 years and then point to the cage as evidence that the technology is unsafe. On who decides, germline editing is embryology-based, so the pathway has to be adapted, not invented from scratch. The FDA already regulates gene therapies, already regulates IVF and pre-implantation genetic testing, PGT. A germline pathway combines these existing frameworks with a modification appropriate for heritability. The sequence is one I described earlier: preclinical data first, patient-derived iPSC validation, research embryo studies within the 14-day rule, off-target and mosaicism sequencing, and later on clinical trials to establish safety and efficacy, then clinical use with longitudinal follow-up, sequencing, and observation over decades. The bar is the same bar we apply to any serious medical intervention.
Glenn.
So I love this slogan, not consensus, but legitimacy. I think I agree with the slogan, but we might mean something slightly different by it. Here's what I mean by it. You mentioned mitochondrial replacement techniques. I think that's a very good model for what I'm thinking of ought to occur. Not merely the FDA process, but an engagement of the public. In the MRT case, the Archbishop of Canterbury had op-eds. It was debated in Parliament. In Singapore and elsewhere, we've seen ideas like deliberative democracy experiments, citizen juries, and the like to educate people. I want to see a widespread public engagement and ultimately legislation and debates in the highest halls of government across the world on this topic. I want the people to be heard, and to me that is a prerequisite, this kind of engagement, for any of this kind of work. Even after that occurs, my own view is this is not a space merely for market actors to behave, but we ought to have, we might agree on this, I'm not sure, as the NSAM suggested, there ought to be a regulatory body that does a case-by-case review of every proposed edit. Besides evaluating the safety of individual uses, there should be verification of full informed consent of all parents. Decision-making is informed by findings from independent international assessments of progress in scientific research, which indicates that the technology has advanced. The details of the approved applications, including genetic conditions, laboratory procedures, clinic conditions, are made publicly accessible for all of us to look at, not merely for the regulators. Monitoring the long-term follow-up of these children who are born generation by generation, where possible publicly sharing the data in a way that would not identify the individuals, and having this research published in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So I want to see both the public engagement on the one hand, but also the governmental engagement on the other. And I think in some ways something like the HFEA in the UK, which has licensed mitochondrial replacement technique by clinic, by application, is appropriate, because there may be some applications that are appropriate and some that are inappropriate, and I think all of us have a stake. For sure, the affected communities, the people with the diseases, have a stake in this. But when it comes to the human genome and gene editing, we all ought to have a voice, and I want us all to be engaged.
Cathy, what do you think about what Glenn said?
I think on a technology level, I agree. But from a level of governance, I have to call out what is actually happening. I think it's great to have idealistic standards on global collaboration, NASEM, things like that. I think it's great, but in reality, what has it actually done in the last 11 years? As I said, there's a lot of papers published, a lot of great reports, a lot of gatherings in beautiful cities, but zero approved therapies. And I don't see anything changing if we just keep citing these acronyms and these idealistic standards. So I hope that something can change, and I think, again, the missing piece is science. So I'm glad that we agree on how to get there from the technology level. I think a key part of this is actually longitudinal studies, because when IVF was first invented in 1978, the person who invented it didn't even get a Nobel Prize until he was on his deathbed, because they had to do 2 generations of observation of the children born through IVF. I do believe the same standard should apply for germline gene correction as well. So I think this technology should be held to a very high standard on the technology level, but I think from a governance and bioethics level, it needs to catch up.
Rebuttal or move on?
Sure. I'll do a quick one, which is to say I'm more optimistic in part because of the story of mitochondrial replacement techniques. As Cathy said, in the US, not available. In the UK and elsewhere, is available. The result in the other places, not in the US, of the kind of public engagement I'm talking about. And I would never think that I would be the person to stand up and defend Congress, and I'm only going to half-heartedly defend our Congress in the United States. But the appropriations rider we have in place right now is the result of a kind of political process, a kind of engagement by the public. And my view would be the best way to do this is to engage the public in saying why it's wrong, to educate the public as to say why there are compelling cases where exceptions ought to be made. And once again, as I started by saying that I thought the policymaking here is too coarse, to arrive at opportunities. But it's much easier to assure the public that we can have fine-grained distinctions than we can have expert reviews when you empower government to be the one doing the review on the back end. And that, again, is the UK model, the HFEA, where we have an authority who is responsive and responsible to the people, not to venture capital, not to the market, but to the people who gets to make the determinations. And you know what? If you don't like it, throw the bums out, as they say. And that is the kind of engagement I'd like to see in this country. And the fact that it has happened elsewhere on mitochondrial replacement techniques gives me some hope that it'll be possible even here in the United States.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you my last question and open it up to questions from the audience in the room and online. People online, it would be, I encourage you to post questions already now because it'll be difficult for us to read them all at the end. So feel free to intervene at this point. My last question is this, and it's a sensitive question. Do you think that using gene editing to prevent certain conditions could be ethically problematic because it would send a hurtful message to those living with us with those conditions? Could it be seen as eugenics? Some disability rights advocates have argued against the use of this technology, especially in the context of using gene editing to prevent heritable deafness that is considered by many not to be a disability, but rather a difference. How would you address these concerns? Glenn, you go first.
Okay, boy, sure, an easy one. So I'll give the cop-out answer, easy answer first, and then I'll move to a harder answer, right? So the easy cop-out answer is deafness does not qualify for the criteria I've described about serious monogenic disease. So it's just out, at least for the time being. Now, of course, if I was a student in my class, I would push them and say, okay, Mr. Cohen, well, what about 20 years from now or 30 years from now? Could you possibly imagine a world where this is possible? And I'm very sensitive to the slogan, nothing about us without us. I'm not a member of the deaf community, and I don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf of the deaf community. And the reason I emphasize that is, again, with this idea of public engagement, part of what I would want to know is, how does the deaf community feel about this topic? Do they feel as though this sends a signal that this is not a choice-worthy life? Do they feel as though this sends a signal that they're not a life and a kind of experience worth having? I also think about this a little bit in the context of my own community. I am gay, and I don't want to speak on the gay community, but I can speak a little bit about this. That if you were to ask me if parents wanted to have gene editing to eliminate homosexuality, would I be okay with that? And can I articulate why that is or unlike eliminating deafness in a population that celebrates, for many people, being deaf and deaf culture? And would we allow people to make a choice not just for their children, but for their children's children, and whether these communities ever exist in the future or not? I think choosing against deafness is, I think, correctly, broadly understood as eugenic, but labeling it as such does not solve the hard normative questions. In the ART PGT context, some have spoken about liberal eugenics, saying that the concern about the Nazi eugenic program, for example, was that it was imposed upon people. But as long as we're letting people make choices, that's something very different normatively and ethically speaking. But I want to emphasize that these are not choices that are unfree or free in some normatively ideal sort of way. They are choices that are constrained by markets, by the availability of technologies, and also whether we have a society that is designed to accommodate people with these lived experiences. It's also a choice that has expressive and practical consequences for the community who's chosen against. And the fact that we're talking now not about sexual reproduction, but a new technology, my own view is that their seat at the table is a very big seat. Whether it's a veto, I'm not sure. But it's certainly a community that I think would have to be engaged. And for the foreseeable future, I don't see this as in bounds.
Cathy.
I heard something get brought up, which is that there's factors like markets that make this access unequal, and that is one of the reasons to not pursue this. I think that's fundamentally an intellectually lazy argument to load the full weight of this problem onto...
I don't think anyone ever called Glenn before.
It's okay. No, let her finish. We'll talk about it.
Thank you, Cathy. You're making it more fun.
That's what I do. I think to say that, even if this is approved and it's a choice that families have, what I just heard is, even if it's choice, it's still not fully an equal choice because some people will be influenced by the markets to have that choice or not. That's what I heard. We can play the tape back if we want to. But I say that's an intellectually lazy argument. I think we are putting the full weight of this problem onto a nascent technology of access. The problem involves insurance, governments, pharma, healthcare systems. I've worked in a lot of these fields too, and to load the full weight of the problem onto a nascent technology like germline gene correction that did not even cause this problem to begin with, and cannot solve it alone, I think that's intellectually lazy. That's just on that note. But on the other question, which is the actual question that I need to answer, I don't think that this is sending a hurtful message. It shouldn't send a hurtful message to people living in these conditions. And in my mind, it's sort of like saying to a cancer patient, hey, you cannot get chemotherapy because it sends a hurtful message to another cancer patient that you get chemotherapy. There's value in your disease. I think that is silly and hypocritical. And if we apply that framework onto germline gene correction unfairly, we're ignoring the rest of the medical field that currently falls under, currently operates the way that it does. And I think that whoever wants that treatment should be able to get it. There should be a choice. There should be no coercion whatsoever. Eugenics, on that note, is a very heavy word as well, and I would prefer to stop throwing that word around when there's no bioethics basis for that. This is a treatment, just like any other treatment you can get for your newborn, like baby KJ's case, or for an adult, or a normal pharmaceutical product. Eugenics is when the states coerce individuals to make certain reproductive choices that they didn't want to make. This is not that. No one's going to force anybody to get this treatment. They would only get it if they want to. And that goes into kind of the next point about deafness. Again, I think we live in a democratic society. If people want to, eventually when this technology becomes available, it doesn't fall into the same, under the first monogenic disorders that we'll be tackling, but eventually when this becomes available, people can choose if they want to pass down that trait or not to their children via germline gene correction. So again, it's all about choice. It's about democracy. And ultimately, it's for the patients. It's giving them more choice and freedom.
Thank you. Wow. The official part of the debate is over.
Can I say one word?
One word.
Okay, one word just to play the tape and turn it up. Is the idea here that we're talking about making choices against a background of a real world. And a world that honors deafness, a world that creates space for deaf people is very different from a world that eliminates them. A world that compares deafness to cancer is very different than a world that acknowledges deaf culture. I think that's important to say that.
Okay. Before you put your boxing gloves on, we're talking about the real world, and we have with us in the room a couple, Asaf and Nicole, who live in the real world with a genetic variant causing disease that could, in Cathy's world, be candidates for gene editing. And Nicole, we want to hear your perspective on everything that you've heard so far today.
Thank you. Sorry, Dan, Ellie, you said a really good thing, and I'm going to get upset. Sorry. We've been at this for 3 years now. We've had multiple embryo transfers. Oh.
Do you want to bring her up?
Is it on?
So everyone can see?
Yeah.
Do you want to come to the podium?
Sorry.
Ooh. Okay. Glenn, you said earlier what we own with children. I can personally say, as a third generation of my disease, I owe my children not to pass it on. My disease causes cancer, and there is no cure for it. It's just preventative invasive procedures every 6 months to every year on every type of my body, blood tests, everything. So for me, it's a case of if I cannot pass that on, I know my mother wouldn't have passed it on, I know my twin sister doesn't want to pass it on, and I know my grandfather wouldn't have passed it on. So as much as we can say within the debate, we're not, for our future generations, I would have this, if Cathy tomorrow said, hey, look, here's your embryos, we'll fix them, I would take it. We've been at IVF now with PGT for 3 years. And they are invasive procedures. The amount of injections I've had, I have to have 4 injections every day for 15 days just to do a retrieval cycle because I have other conditions which add to it. And I can tell you it's painful, and the bruises it causes is horrible. So if I can get double the amount of embryos that we get, because my condition is dominant, it will only give me half of what we end up getting, or even less than that if the biopsies, unfortunately, end the life of the embryos in itself. So out of, I don't know, 40 embryos, we only got 8 in the case of the last 3 years that we could use viably. So if I could get even a touch more of those, we would by now have our first child. We'd probably be on to the second child. And I would be having to stab myself a lot less than I do now. So I am all for this treatment, and I can say that we're the lucky ones. We can choose PGT. I know a lot with my condition don't have that option, and they just have to do it naturally. So for me, we are lucky, but we're also not lucky at the same time. So I am full for this, and even if it's me making the decision for future generations, I will make that happily without a moment's thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I just add one more thing about future generations, we're always talking about the future generations of the embryos that have been edited. What about the embryos that never got to that point because we had PGT? We chose not to use them. You could say, oh, we did make that choice for those future generations. I think that's, for us, like Nicole said, an easy choice to make. I don't want to live with the guilt of having to pass that on. And I think that those should also be taken into account, and we would have to live with it, and I'm sorry.
Yeah, basically, there are so many embryos that could have had a life that we chose not to give a life, so it's the opposite as well of they could have been a living, breathing human if they were healthy ones instead of, unfortunately, unhealthy ones.
Thank you both. Thank you. Thank you so much. Wow, we need a moment. But I'm so grateful that you're here in the room with us, because we talk about public engagement, we talk about real world. Your voices are critically important in this conversation. And Glenn was hoping himself that your voices would be around the table. So we're all grateful that you're here. I'd like to start taking questions from the audience. Obviously, try not to repeat the exact question that I asked, or not even a nuance on it, because there's so much to unpack here. So prioritize the questions that are new, that we haven't heard Glenn and Cathy on. And I'm going to start with one question from the audience online. We have hundreds of people watching. Julia, give us the best one.
Oh, gosh, that's a lot of pressure. Well, gatekeeper's privilege here. I would mention that we've discussed somatic editing as an alternative to some of what we've been dialoguing about, but I'm seeing quite a number of questions of how this fits alongside other reproductive options, like run-of-the-mill embryo screening, donor gametes. How should we weigh gene editing against these alternatives when thinking about what's ethically justified? A number of people have asked. And also in cases where the primary goal is having a genetically related child, which is so poignant and so impactful, some have questioned, is that sufficient justification given other pathways like fostering and adoption? What will happen to those options?
Glenn, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So I think there's a serious question here about the value of genetic relatedness, especially the value of genetic relatedness for both parents. Now, most people who are heterosexual who reproduce, that's part of their life goals, is to see their genetic inheritance passed forward. But you might say, sure, but at what cost, right? My view is that adoption meets a social need, but it's a social need that should be spread amongst all of us, that we should not be targeting those who suffer from infertility or those who suffer from particular diseases and say, it's on you to handle adoption, to help with adoption. So I don't think that's a good argument. I do, though, in the first part of your question, I do think that we should be thinking about this as sequencing. When we're talking about engaging in an experimental, risky, new procedure without a track record, we should only be doing that when we're in a position where existing technologies are not up to the task. And so for me, it is a criteria of being an appropriate use case that PGT, for example, is not available as a solution for a particular couple.
So let me push you. What if your husband is the carrier and you could use sperm donation?
So I think the most compelling cases are where that's not possible. I am of the view that we do many things in this world to honor the idea that both parents want to have a genetic relationship. And I think often about the first moments of IVF, and there were, by the way, widespread public engagement. There were debates covered by the newspapers, and you can read the archival accounts at the time of IVF as well, and that's the kind of passionate engagement of the public I'd like to see. But IVF itself can sometimes be solved by slipping out one of the two gamete donors for an actual outside gamete donor. And I think that if you're talking, again, about serious monogenetic diseases, it is an appropriate conversation to think whether heritable gene editing is appropriate in that circumstance. So I would not insist on the idea that if we could use a sperm donor, it's definitely off the table. But the most compelling cases, and the cases I would say we should start with to learn about this, is cases where that's not possible.
Thank you. Cathy, do you want to answer that?
Sure, I'll keep it brief. I think the last question that you asked, Vardit, was does germline gene correction for certain diseases, does it send a hurtful message to groups that have that condition? And I actually want to pose that question here. Does it send a hurtful message to tell someone you have a disease mutation, so therefore your partner needs to get a donor sperm donor or egg donor instead? I think that actually sends a very hurtful message in the reality of things when we get into the real world. Not to mention, I think PGT alone is not going to be able to solve the problem. Discarding embryos is not a sustainable solution. It is not realistic in terms of scalability and something that people actually want to do. I mean, we just heard from the patients themselves. I think that speaks volumes on its own. It's a very painful process to go through rounds and rounds of IVF, and especially for the women, and also very cost prohibitive as well. So I think both technologies should coexist, both PGT, so embryo sequencing, as well as germline gene correction. Especially if the couple wants to have multiple healthy children, I think it's very important that we save and use as many available embryos as possible, which germline gene correction can help create, because we can help correct the affected embryos and correct them of their mutation. So that's my general sense.
Thank you. I'd like to take a question from the room.
Hello, thank you for being here. What an insightful conversation. This question is about geopolitical implications and competition. Do you not think it's unethical for us not to master this technology? When you master technology as a nation, you have an uneven influence in how it's proliferated across the world. So I would prefer to live in a country that could influence this technology versus having to adhere to another country's standards and norms.
That is a new question. Thank you. In all fairness, Cathy should go first.
Sure. Well, I think the United States is the gold standard for bioethics globally, which is why I chose to build this company in the United States under complete IRB oversight for all of my research methodologies and protocols and patient consent forms. I think that the United States should maintain its status as the leader of gene editing and bioethics in the world by advancing this technology in the most responsible way, which is what I'm proposing. I think that this technology eventually will be used globally. Many countries will already have a keen interest in this technology. So this is inevitable. It's very important that the United States understands its advantages right now when it comes to pioneering gene editing tools, as well as bioethics and regulation, but it needs to continue moving forward to lead the world in this.
There may be many good arguments for why we should allow germline gene editing. The argument that Russia will do it first is not one of them, as far as I'm concerned. The view is that we have been a leader here, and actually at the moment there is a worldwide moratorium, even in China, where the first unethical experiments were undertaken, it's prohibited. And if anything, I think we should be a leader in solidifying our views about what a rational regulatory approach to this and public engagement should look like, not race to the finish line because we're worried that we're going to be outcompeted. What we should be racing ahead on is showing that we are a country that takes public engagement and ethics seriously, not one that is worried about losing the gene race.
Thank you. These were powerful answers. Thank you for the question. We're going to take one question online and then Barry.
So I'm synthesizing here, but we've had some people ask about procreative beneficence, right? The idea that parents should give their child the best possible start in life. And some people are combining this with this sort of slippery slope argument, right? If these technologies become safe and accessible, could that create not just permission, but a pressure, even potentially an obligation to use these tools? And how do we avoid that sliding into more expansive territory over time, given the tenuousness of the enhancement therapy divide?
Glenn, you go first.
Okay, great. So two answers. First a regulatory one, then first a philosophical one, then a regulatory one. The philosophical one is there's a hard question to be answered for gene editing, which is to say, are we talking about replacing one child with another, or are we talking about making a child's life go better or worse? The idea of procreative beneficence is really often talked about in person-affecting terms, to use the philosophical jargon, harm and benefit. But there's an open question, I think, about what kinds of edits actually do that, make someone better or worse, like helping your child get over an illness, versus replacing them with a better child. And replacing, when we start talking about replacing these children with better children, that has a very different valence and a very different meaning in terms of the moral math of it. I think we have to be careful. The more regulatory answer here is, if this is what we are worried about, and I think it's a reasonable worry, then I think the best bulwark on that is, again, to empower regulators who are answerable to the public to be the ones to decide about what's in bounds and what's out, as opposed to allowing merely parents who want something to have it on the basis of wanting it. And when I talk about the logic of the market, that is what I was referring to.
You have a lot of faith in regulators for...
More than the market, at least.
Cathy.
Can you repeat the question?
I'll repeat it from here, and I'll make it even more concise. A prevalent argument in the bioethics literature is that we have an ethical obligation to have the child with the best possible life ahead of them. So how do these arguments impact? It's kind of a ball into your court. How do these arguments impact our view of the technology?
Well, if you want the best life for your child, then you should correct the disease mutation that's well characterized and deeply pathogenic. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Yeah, that's why I said the ball goes straight into the net. Thank you.
The question really was also about coercion. I've taken care of families where parents don't want therapies that are so proven to be of benefit, and they end up being taken to court for a decision to be made. If this becomes a so-called standard of care, parents don't have a say anymore. So is that a risk of coercion?
Thank you, Barbara. So I'll reiterate, because you didn't have the microphone at the beginning. If this is established as a safe and effective technology, could we see a future where parents are obligated by regulation to treat their early embryo, because it would be seen as preventing a disease and ensuring the life ahead of the child is better? We're seeing a fascinating analogy now in the emerging technology of artificial wombs, artificial uterus, where we're concerned that if a woman wants to terminate her pregnancy later on, the regulator would say, okay, we will separate you from the fetus, but the fetus goes into the artificial uterus, there will still be a child born. So sometimes the introduction of a technology has all the good intentions of autonomy and choice, but something can happen in the political landscape to turn that choice into an obligation. So thank you. It's almost like a new question. So I'll give Cathy the right, and then Glenn, and then go to Barry.
Look, I think choice is very important here. Parents should not be coerced into choosing any particular therapy or diagnostic or anything for that matter. So that needs to be structural in its kind of clinical translation and distribution of the technology post-approval. I think there's always going to be fear and hypotheticals, but that shouldn't stop us from working on the technology for the very well-defined cases where people actually need this technology. There's always going to be hypotheticals, always going to be fear. I mean, we talk about that with every other technology industry as well. But this one, for some reason, it has stopped any progress whatsoever on the science. And that's what I cannot stand by. I think fear and hypotheticals can be discussed, but it should not stop the science from progressing in a way that actually benefits the public and benefits the patients that need it most.
Thank you. Could we consider you as
I
have answered?
I can skip this one if you want.
Okay. Barry, please.
I'm Barry Kohler from Rockefeller University. For full disclosure, I served on the National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Medicine committee back in 2017 that wrote, I think, probably the first real report on this subject. I don't think it's accurate to say that we said stop. We did not. We specifically said go ahead, but under very, very strict circumstances. A number of those were actually specified by Glenn in his presentation. So I think it's really important to understand that we actually felt compelled to lay out a path where there was consent and where there were clearly a genetic disease that was profoundly important, in which there really were not alternatives. So I want to be clear about that. The issue of public opinion was really fascinating for us to learn about on the committee. And the example that was given to us was the same one that Glenn gave, in vitro fertilization. And so we knew that within weeks of the first successful baby, public opinion had swung dramatically. And so we said, yes, you need public engagement, but is that the day before the first success, or is that the day after the first success? So I think we need to temper the role of public opinion and put it in context. Just say mitochondrial replacement therapy was actually done in the United States, done in New Jersey. It wasn't done for the reasons of mitochondrial repair for a genetic disorder. It was done for infertility, and it wasn't even done with an IRB review.
Many years ago.
But that's a whole other story. The point about in vitro fertilization in the UK is really fascinating because, as Glenn pointed out, it is regulated and it is controlled. In the United States, it's not controlled or regulated in any meaningful way. And it's my understanding, at least the last time I reviewed this, that they would not approve in vitro fertilization for deafness, where obviously here in this country it has been used for that. And so I think it's important to understand the context of what choices we've made versus where others have made very, very different ones. I think one of the things that has not been discussed except touched on is this issue of who pays. It's great to talk about somatic repair, and I actually served on a review committee at Penn that learned about the first child. But the reality is that until you get insurance coverage, you're really not making it publicly available. And I think that that's a really much more complicated issue. But obviously, somatic repair has all of the downsides that we've heard of, and obviously also has the expense. I guess the last thing, I also want to point out that we learned that PGD success is actually painfully low overall. I think there's a misunderstanding about the likelihood of success. The last time I reviewed this, it was something under about 25%. I'm getting some nodding over here, and I guess it hasn't changed very much. So people who think that PGD is a simple answer to this problem really need to look hard at the actual data. And I guess to be controversial, I just say all of this is just halfway therapy, because in vitro gametogenesis is moving along. And when that occurs, it'll really blow your head off in terms of all of the downstream implications. So I might want to just ask each of you, the final question would be, what do you think will happen with in vitro gametogenesis relative to this debate?
So first of all, Barry, thank you I'm glad that some of your comments were on the side of Glenn and some on the side of Cathy. Very balanced, beautifully done. For the audience online, IVG is a technology that would allow us to make a gamete from a cell, for example, a skin cell, and that would revolutionize reproduction at an even deeper level than gene editing. Glenn, you've written extensively on this technology. Any comment?
Yeah, just to say that I think that this is an alternative kind of future, but it's one in some ways that's radically different than ours. The idea that we could take your skin and create thousands of embryos, thousands of eggs, and thousands of sperm and not have to go through IVF and choose from them is in some ways very discomforting, especially people who believe embryo destruction is problematic. On the flip side, it's about choosing X versus Y as opposed to changing the life of an individual and changing the inheritance going forward. So it's to say that there are dragons in both directions is the way I would put it. And I think that that's worthy of ethical debate, and luckily it's an ethical debate I participated in too.
Well, maybe we have a debate on that next year and invite you back. Kathy, do you want to say a word about IVG? Or?
Yeah, sure. Well, IVG is a really cool concept. I admit that. But the biggest difference between germline gene correction and IVG is that IVG is nowhere close to being able to be used on humans. But germline gene correction already has, although in a controversial sense, but it has. And the newest gene editors like base editing and prime editing do show a lot of promise in being able to do it even safer now in human embryos. So the difference is that this technology is already here. IVG is still a hypothetical technology. This is why it's imbalanced. I think it's the ethics and the morals of using either technology is therefore different. It's a moral imperative that we start using the technology that is already here on the people that need it most. Sure, we can talk about hypotheticals, but it's very different.
We probably have time for 2 more questions, so I'll take one from the floor and one. Lee, no?
The question was asked earlier.
Okay. Yes. Blair?
I'm looking.
A short one.
I'm looking for a headline. If there could be a headline tomorrow that 3 leaders have agreed, I'm dead serious, on one intervention that would help one family make a difference in their lives now, having sat on the sidelines for 11 years, which is what I've heard, what would that be?
In terms of what condition would be targeted?
Yeah. Tomorrow we should go forward and do X to help parents with Y.
I'm going to be in support of anything because I talk to these families almost every day. I want them to get the treatment they deserve. So,
is there one that's so compelling? Which condition? What condition?
Severe monogenic conditions. Well, why don't we take this example right here? The condition that...
We're just asking for a specific example of the condition.
I think the question should be directed towards Glenn because he's the limiting reagent, as we call it in a chemistry equation.
Being reagents, the best thing someone's called me in years. Okay, so I would say something like Tay-Sachs, Lex-Nyhan. These are the kinds of disorders I have in mind for qualifying.
Yeah, I think Tay-Sachs is the poster child of severe disease, premature death, pain and suffering, no treatment, dominant, monogenic. I think if we had to name one, that would be the prime candidate. Do you have your headline? Quick one, short one from the online audience.
Yeah, we're getting I don't know, it's doing much here. We're still getting a lot of comments about access. If this becomes available, how do we think about who gets access to it? How do we avoid deepening existing inequities in reproductive or genetic medicine? And it sort of latches into the previous comment about how to prioritize when there's so many conditions that might be deserving for this attention.
Okay, so if it's possible, who pays? Glenn, you want to go first?
I'll say that this is a space where we need more creative thinking, but part of it is a question of financing and a question about if the benefit really is multi-generational benefit. The problem is that the payer exists only in the present moment, but the benefit propagates forward in the future. So what we really need is thinking about complicated structures like intergenerational mortgages and stuff like that, and savings for a payer like a Medicare, Medicaid, in terms of reimbursement policy, that those would be the creative areas I would like to think about. And indeed, we've seen some of this in the somatic space where there's a similar problem in that people change insurers on average every few years, so not one insurer can capture all the benefit. And bringing people together in a way to think about this problem as a finance problem and a time problem, I think is a promising direction.
Kathy.
Intergenerational mortgages is the most terrifying term I've ever heard in my life. No, thank you. I mean, I think financially it is different, right? Somatic gene therapies, it's sort of like you got to pay for it, and then your child still has to inherit the disease, and they got to pay for it again. So it's almost like a generational subscription. The great thing about germline gene correction, if done properly, is that you don't have that anymore. It's a one-time cure, and that's it. In terms of answering that question of accessibility, how it compares to current options. I think that when you look at somatic gene therapies, on average, they cost $2 to $3 million per patient per dose. Castor-V, there's ones for eye disease, so many, they're all in that range. I can guarantee you that whatever gets developed and approved in germline is going to be a fraction of that, like 1% of that. You know, I think that is what is unique about this technology, is that when you intervene at the earliest stages, it's technically less difficult to create, because that's only when you're 1 or 2 or 4 cells, versus as adults we're all trillions of cells. The reason why it's so expensive and so invasive is because out of trillions of cells we have to deliver those genetic changes to the right cells, and that delivery mechanism is a big bottleneck in the gene therapy space today, and that's why it's so expensive and so difficult. But if we solve that problem with germline gene correction, it'll be way more accessible to more people, because it is, 1, technically more efficient to do, and 2, financially easier to pay for from the family's angle.
Okay, we have 1 minute to the end of the online event. The privileged audience in the room can continue the conversation, but I'm going to go all Blair on you and ask each one of you for a 30-second take-home message for our audience. Cathy, you go first.
Sure. Well, I think that there is an emperor wears no clothes quality to this debate. The people inside the field are sometimes too afraid to state the obvious, and I think that's partly why I'm here tonight, because sometimes we need somebody from the outside to say the simple things. So here are the simple things. Whether we agree tonight or not, this field is going to move forward. It has been inevitable from the start. The only open questions are how, with whom, and under what conditions. The technology is real, the families are asking, and delay does not make the safer, only research does. If we want to be ethical, we have to do the science, openly, with oversight, and with the patients and carriers in the room with us. Thank you.
Glenn, can you beat that?
If the emperor is naked, I don't want to be ruled by them. And essentially, what I really want is a world where we all participate and we make decisions about this collectively. And I reject the idea that the technological imperative is inevitable, that this is going to happen whatever we say. Instead, I believe that we can come together and we can make decisions about what rational regulation in this space should look like, and we all deserve a seat at the table.
Thank you. Thank you to the people